Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon, I guess.
Yeah.
Welcome. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our On the Issues program, focusing on the Marquette Law Poll. And as always, I'm joined by the poll director, Dr. Charles Franklin. Charles, it's good to see you.
And you. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to have you all here. Just to give you a little idea of how we're going to tackle this time that we have together, is I'm going to go through a couple of the topics of the day, and then we'll go right into the poll and poll results. I'll take some breaks during the poll review for questions. So if you have some, jot them down. We'll take them during the program, and then there'll also be questions after the program. But just to give you an idea about the topics that we're going to be tackling today, first we're going to do the methodology of the poll. We're going to talk about the primaries for governor, both the Republican and Democratic side. April Supreme Court election, which is near and dear to my heart as a former judge. Top issues of concern for those who are polled. Inflation and the economic situation. State issues here in Wisconsin. National issues across the country. And finally, job approval ratings. So, Charles, can we let's jump right into it? We have a lot of information.
Absolutely. So here we go. The usual methodology story. The survey was in the field October 15th through the 22nd. We interviewed 846 registered voters in the state. That has a margin of error of 4.6 percentage points. In order to ask about a lot of policy issues and issue concerns, we divide the sample into two halves. Each of them is 426 people in a half. And that has a margin of error of 6.4 percentage points. There we go. And then for the party primaries, which of course, parties aren't more than the sample. So for the Republicans, people who are voting in the Republican primary, that's 406 respondents, a margin of error of 4.6 or 6.4. And for the Democratic sample, it's 378 with a margin of error of 6.9 percentage points. The partisan makeup of the sample is 36% Republican, 32 Dem, 33 Independent. If you include independents who lean to a party and often do vote with that party, then it's 46 Republican, 42 Democratic, and 13 who are independent and say they're not closer to either party. In our polls in 2024, across all of the 2024 polling, we had 33% Republican, 31 Democratic, so it's a little bit higher now, a 4-point gap rather than a 2-point gap last year. And if you include those leaners as partisans, then it was a 3-point gap last year, 45-42. So we're just slightly more Republican than we were throughout the 2024 calendar year.
So let's jump into the race for governor here in Wisconsin.
Well, I don't know. Should we?
Let's do it.
And because that's the answer that people give us. 70% of Republican primary voters say they don't know how they'll vote. And 81% of Democratic primary voters say they don't know where to vote.
So I have a chance.
You have a chance.
Okay.
You have a chance. And it's not too late.
It doesn't appear to be.
You can still organize your air war for this. It's not surprising. I've been telling people for a long time, our colleague Craig Gilbert has been writing about this, that this is the first time we've had a primary in both parties with no incumbent running in a long, long time. And we're a year out, almost just barely more than a year away from the general election, less than that till the primary. So I don't think this is at all surprising, but I think I'm leading with it here because I think it's so important to remind us junkies that most folks haven't tuned into either of these races, and the candidates, because of their non-incumbent status, all have a very long ways to go to develop name identification and develop feelings, either positive or negative, towards the candidates and their candidacy.
And before we go that far, people don't even know there's a race
Well, exactly. We didn't ask that question, but it's not uncommon to have people go, oh, is there an election this year? I thought that was in 2028. So, yeah, it's not top of the mind for a lot of people. I will say, come next fall, people will be keenly aware of this race. So these numbers are going to change. But if you go back and look at all of the primaries we've polled on since 2012, when we first started the poll, there's generally been almost no gain in name recognition until the summer. So sometime between June and August is when people tune in and the name ID starts to go up and people have more positive or negative feelings. So we'll obviously keep polling on this race, but the point is to track when that starts to develop, and it's got a long ways to go before it gets there. You get the same kind of result if you ask, how much have you read or heard about the governor's race? Just 6% say they've heard a lot about the governor's race. More than a majority, 57%, say they've heard a little, and 37%, more than a third, say they haven't heard anything at all about the governor's race. So you can see why people wouldn't have made up their minds yet. If you look at decision-making by how much you've heard, that top line is people who've heard a lot or a little. I'm combining those two categories because out of 847 respondents, a total of 23 people said they'd heard a lot. So it makes no sense to try to break down the numbers by 23 people. So that's why I put those two together. But you can see that there's a little less undecided if you've heard something about the campaign as opposed to the bottom row where you've heard nothing at all. But it's still 2/3 of Republicans and nearly 3/4 of Democrats who haven't made up their mind. So again, I think that's completely in keeping with what we expect it to be.
Who do Republican voters favor?
So this is favorability. So the red dots over there on the far right are the people who say they haven't heard enough to have an opinion about each of these candidates. Andy Mansky is a medical services technician from Franklin. Josh Schoeman is, of course, the Washington County executive, and Tom Tiffany's the 7th Congressional District member of Congress. You can see that Tiffany's the better known. Only, in quotes, 61% say they haven't heard enough about him to have an opinion. That was 75% in June of 2023, by the way, so he's a little better known now than he was then. And you can see on the positive and negative sides, there's very little difference across these candidates. There's a 3-point difference for Tiffany, a 1 point for Schoeman, a 3-point for Mansky. These are very small differences, and they just reflect the fact that people haven't tuned into the race very much. But along this set, you can certainly say that Tiffany has a little bit of an advantage on name ID, but he's still got a long ways to go.
Who do Democrats favor?
Again, look at all the red dots. The Democratic candidates are at least as little known, really across the board. Of the ones that are a little bit better known, David Crowley at 74% haven't heard enough, and Sarah Rodriguez at 75% are the two that are a little bit better known than the other candidates, but by this small margin. And you can see from the green and purple dots that favorability is low. Of course, if most people say they don't know enough, they're not going to give you a favorable reading. So there's not much of a gap across favorability for these candidates. Rodriguez has a slightly positive by 1 point, 13 to 12 favorable, net favorable.
Is that unusual, though, Charles, that the lieutenant governor isn't that well known?
Yeah, it's not unusual at all that the lieutenant governor is not well known. When we've asked about the lieutenant governor in the past, not been well known. Even the attorney general, which is a more consequential position in the state than the lieutenant governor, constitutionally, I mean, is very little known. We haven't asked about Josh Call in a long time, but in previous years when we have asked about different attorney generals, they all have very low name ID. It just reflects that even if you hold a pretty important statewide office, you're not in the news every day. The governor generally is and has pretty high name recognition, but the 2 U.S. senators who are not in the news every day usually have between 15 and 25% that say they haven't heard about them. And, you know, both of our senators have been in office for quite a while, so to find up to a quarter saying, oh, I don't know enough about them, is telling about the state of attention to these folks. I should have mentioned on the previous slide here that Showman has a +1 net favorability rating. So does Rodriguez. Those are the only two with a net positive. But I don't make much of that because, again, the differences are quite small across these candidates.
Now, this is something new. You broke it down by media markets.
Yeah. Regionalism can make a difference, and it really does. Look at, this is the percent who recognize the name and have an opinion about the candidate, okay? And so the bottom line is the interesting one. That's where Tiffany, in the northern and western media markets in the state, has a 60% name ID rating, meaning only 40% say they don't know enough about him there. 60% recognize and rate him on this favorability rating. That north and west of the state, of course, overlaps largely with his congressional district. So it's just what you would expect. There's a home field advantage. People do know him from the district that he's in. With Showman, the Milwaukee market is his best known area. I don't know that the Washington County exec makes the news every day in the area, but in this media market, he's clearly better known here than he is elsewhere. I won't go through each individual dot, but a story here in the Republican primary and on the next slide in the Democratic primary is that people in both the Green Bay media market and in the north and west of the state know all of the candidates less well than people in either the Milwaukee or the Madison markets. Part of that's home field, but not all of it. And Tiffany, of course, is the real exception with the north and west. Let's go to the Democrats. Here, Crowley stands out with a 42% name ID in the Milwaukee market, followed by Rodriguez at 31 in the Milwaukee market. So that's the home field advantage, not nearly as big as Tiffany's was, but still noticeable. Francesca Hahn from Madison at 27% ID is at 27 here, 28 in Madison, also shows a little bit about that. And the others, Kelderoy's from Madison has a little bit of a bump in the Madison market. But again, with a couple of exceptions, pretty much doesn't matter where in the state you are.
Any questions on this so far, the media markets, or in regards to the lack of knowledge of the candidates? All right, we'll keep moving. Let's do the Republican primary choices.
Yep, so again, with the caveat of how little known these folks are. Mansky gets 0% support, Showman 6%, Tiffany 23%, but then there's that 70% that haven't decided that really stands out. So clearly an advantage to Tiffany at this point, but still a long ways to go before anyone is really clinching the nomination. On the Democratic side, where it's 81% don't know, nobody gets over 6%. Hong is at 6%, Rodriguez at 4%, Crowley at 3%, and Roy's also at 3%, Missy Hughes at 2%, and Ryan Sternad and Brett Halsey both at 0, less than 0.5%. Again, partly this is you've got 7 Democratic candidates as opposed to 3 in the Republican field, so it's spread out a little bit more among those who've decided. But still, 81% undecided is a bit more than the 70% undecided in the Republican primary. I just think we're far from knowing who a front runner is in the Democratic side.
All right. Let's shift gears to my favorite topic, Supreme Court candidates.
They're not well known either. Hardly a surprise, but even less well known than the gubernatorial candidates, despite the fact that this is an April election, so we're closer to it. But I think the campaign activity in the Supreme Court race has been a lot less visible than the still somewhat limited campaign activity on the governor's race. So 86% said they didn't know enough about Maria Lazar to have an opinion. 84% said the same of Chris Taylor. You can see that their favorable and unfavorable numbers are very close to each other, slightly more unfavorable than favorable, but really people don't know. Now, I will tell you, I anticipated this, and so while I did ask the primary question for the governor's race, I didn't see any point in asking a vote question with two candidates that I was confident would be this little known. So we'll take more looks at this in February and March as the race gets heated up and people actually tune in. But that's why we don't have a horse race question on the Supreme Court at this stage.
Now, this next slide is important to me because it's the one that determines what people know about those candidates, like a clear idea what they stand for.
Yeah. So the question is, do you have a clear idea or don't you know enough at this point to have a clear idea? And the same story, 69% in this case for both of them say they haven't heard enough at all to have an opinion about what they stand for. But 21% for Lazar and 19% for Taylor say, I don't have a clear idea. Not that I don't know anything about them, but I don't have a clear idea. I don't know where the dividing line is between haven't heard anything about them and not having a clear idea. But you can see that the clear idea, the green dots, is just 10% for Lazar and 11% for Taylor. Again, an important thing that we'll monitor as the election gets closer and people start to develop some impressions of the candidates. But it's clearly too soon for that to have happened.
But I would argue that that's how you want it to be, right? You want your Supreme Court candidates to not clearly stand for anything right now, right? I mean, that's what the goal.
Yeah.
At least that's the goal they taught us as judges, is that you shouldn't be a judge that people are like, oh, they're going to be this way every single time.
Exactly. This is the dilemma we'll come back to in a minute as well, is this state, in its wisdom, chooses to elect Supreme Court justices. You can argue whether that's good or bad, but that is our rule. How are people supposed to choose among those candidates? Well, character, integrity, other things that in the past we tended to emphasize in Supreme Court races, support from law enforcement, support from lawyers or other district attorneys. Those used to be prominent in campaign ads for the court back in the 90s. You don't hear that much anymore as the races have become more partisan, more politicized. But it does leave the candidates, on the one hand, who are limited in what they're supposed to be able to talk about in pending cases. And the problem, so they have some dilemmas about how much to say. But voters saying, who are these people and what am I voting for, given that the court is a pretty consequential place? How do you decide that? And I don't have the answer to it, but I'm pointing out that at this moment, people are pretty fuzzy about where the candidates are. And we'll see more about that in just a minute as well.
All right, move on to likely to vote.
So despite such little attention to these races so far, 69% of registered voters say they will vote in the Supreme Court election in April. That's probably a little high from what the actual number will end up being, but we've been setting records for Supreme Court turnout for the last several cycles, so it'll be pretty high. The dark green dot on the right is the absolutely certain to vote number. And the important things to notice here is for independents, that drops off to 52% certain to vote. That's not unusual for independents to be less likely to vote, and especially so in spring elections. And for the parties, 69% of Republicans, but 74% of Democrats saying they're certain to vote in the election. That reflects a little bit of an advantage for Democrats that we've seen in turnout in the last number of Supreme Court elections. It's not guaranteed to hold up, but it does show up by just a 5-point margin, but a little bit of an advantage to the Democrats on this likely turnout question.
And it's an important race, but unlike the other Supreme Court races, there's no shift in the court that's going to happen in this election.
That's right. Back in February, we asked a question about whether the majority on the court could change as a result of the election. And a surprisingly high percentage, I seem to recall it was in the high 60s, knew that the majority of the court could flip. So that was being pretty tuned in to what you might think is a sort of esoteric question. I mean, if we asked, are there 7 justices or 9 justices on the state Supreme Court, we might find a little confusion about that number. And is the majority male or female might be less confusing now than it used to be, but it's pretty clear now. Nevertheless, you don't expect folks to have detailed knowledge of the institution and so on. But we will see, given that this year the majority is not up for grabs, how that affects how many people tune in and what turnout might be and how the campaigns are run for that matter.
Now, this next slide has to do with what you're talking about, how people want to hear about issues from the candidates.
So the question is, should Supreme Court candidates discuss issues so voters know what they stand for, or should they avoid talking about issues so as not to give the appearance of prejudging cases that may come before them? It's a legitimate and really relevant question to talk about. But overwhelmingly, people want them to talk about the issues. 83% to 17% say they should discuss issues. And that's across the partisan divide. 82% of Republicans want them to talk about issues, 86% of Democrats, and 76% of independents. So there's clearly a desire, and this was what we saw last spring as well in the February poll. People want this discussion to take place and pity the poor judge.
Because you can't. Supreme Court rules say you can't talk about the issue.
And where does that line fall between discussing issues but not cases, not pending cases? How do you do that? And we're seeing, I think, and you've seen it in the candidates over the last several elections, some veering a little closer to talking about details, others staying far away from that. I don't think the candidates have, and the political world in general, has really quite figured out what to do in these races. But the public would like to know something about what they're voting for.
Well, the candidates should know what to do because the Supreme Court rules tell you what you can't do.
These lawyer types, they think there are rules that matter. Us politicos just care about the election. Okay. Partisan courts. Yep. So given everything, we ask a question, which of these two things comes closer to your opinion? Supreme Court elections have become so partisan that we should just make them partisan elections, or we should keep the current system of electing Supreme Court justices through nonpartisan elections. And here, opinion's fairly divided. 56% say partisan elections, 43% keep the current nonpartisan elections. So that's a little bit more for partisan election. But it's striking that that's especially true of Republicans, where 63% say we should shift to partisan court elections among Republicans, whereas both independents and Democrats are virtually dead even divided on this question. So it's interesting where that is and what conversations are going on in the Republican world about partisan versus nonpartisan court elections.
What, just to show of hands here in the room, who thinks that the election should be partisan elections, Supreme Court race? It's a show of hands, okay? Who thinks they shouldn't be partisan? Should be the way they are right now? Yeah, it's interesting.
You're obviously typical of the electorate.
Yeah, but that makes sense, right? Because
yes,
I mean, if they're staged that way on purpose, right? they're spring elections because they're nonpartisan,
Yeah.
and they're November elections because they're partisan. Once you make them partisan, everything's in November, and then you can just throw out everything.
You do, and that's something that's not much talked about. Among other things, it would mean that the Supreme Court primary would have to happen in August along with all the other partisan primaries. And the court would then,
Nobody
both
would care.
pros and cons,
Nobody would
be
care.
competing with presidential and gubernatorial and Senate elections in the fall. So those are topics that probably deserve some discussion if we ever move to the point of seriously thinking about changing the timing of the court races. At this point, it's talked about. I don't know that it's actually a pending proposal that would go through anytime soon.
But that's my fear. My fear is that those Supreme Court races won't mean much.
Yeah, yeah. As important as the office is. Okay.
Any questions on that? What we just talked about there in regards to the Supreme Court races? I already asked a question about the partisan nature of it. That was just me personally. Okay, perfect. We can move on to issues and concerns, which always seem to be really popular.
So one of the things that we did this in 2022 and 24 and expect to continue this through the year is what are the issues that people are concerned about as opposed to picking between candidates and that sort of thing. So we went through 10 different issues, and for each one we asked, how concerned are you about this issue? So what I'm showing you here is the percent that say they were very concerned about the issue. And you can see that the number one issue on this list is inflation and the cost of living at 69%, very concerned about that. Health insurance at 60% is a little bit of a surprise, though there's certainly current conversation about cost increases for insurance and the expiration of tax credits for insurance, so maybe that explains why this is bumped up. If we went back to 2008, health insurance would have been much higher on everybody's list. This year, it's a little surprising to see it come in second place, but there it is. Followed by public schools at 56%, tied with gun violence at 56%. Then jobs in the economy at 53%, and affordability of housing at 53%, abortion policy at 50%, taxes at 48%, illegal immigration and border security at 45%, next to the bottom, but hold on to the next slide. And finally, crime in your community at 31%. One thing to point out here is I'm deliberately asking about crime in your community, where you live, rather than just an amorphous crime without any other context to it. But that was 27% in 2022. It's 31% now, not a big bump from it. And it was near the bottom in 2022 as well. So this is not a fluke that crime is as low on this list. If we look at it by party, and I know this is going to take some study, read it row by row because that's the only way you'll make sense of it. The main point here is compare the red dot and the blue dot. Look at inflation. 83% of Democrats say inflation is very concerning, as do 79% of independents, but only 54% of Republicans say they're that concerned about inflation. If you look at health insurance, there's this giant gap, 83 for Democrats, 39 for Republicans. Well, that reflects the long-term fight between the parties over health care, the Affordable Care Act, and so on. So you get a understandable big divide there, maybe a less understandable divide on inflation. Gun violence, again, Democrats very concerned, Republicans not so concerned. But come down to the next to the bottom, illegal immigration and border security, 75% of Republicans very concerned about that, just 16% of Democrats and 31% of independents. So I said, hold on for that immigration question. Here you see is a giant party split on this issue. And you can go through the others. If you pick up the press release, you can read the table with all these numbers in it. But there's some sort of classic partisan issues where there's a big division on concern. Others, not such a big division. Public schools, there's actually a smaller division than you might expect. 64% of Democrats very concerned, 52% of Republicans very concerned. But when you zoom in on that a little bit, it's Democrats are concerned about one set of issues for schools. Republicans are concerned about a different set of issues for schools. So they both end up pretty concerned about schools, but for rather different reasons. Now, the next one is, of those 10 issues, we ask people, which is the most important to you? Not just how concerned, but which is most important. So number one remains inflation and the cost of living. I don't know that that's too surprising. But the second one becomes immigration. Remember, very concerned was low on immigration, but it's high on most important. Why? Because Republicans are very concerned about immigration, and they're more likely to pick immigration as their most important issue. So that lifts it up in this overall most important concern, whereas few Democrats are picking it, a modest number of independents. Health insurance just a little bit down at 14, jobs in the economy at 9, gun violence at 9, affordability of housing at 9. Look down the list a little bit, taxes at 6, abortion at 4. That's a dramatic change from where it was in 2022, right after the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision striking down Roe versus Wade. And look at crime and public schools at 2% for crime, 4% for public schools. So again, public schools had a pretty high level of concern, but it doesn't mean it's the topic that's really driving people to the polls.
All right, grocery prices.
A favorite topic of mine. So this is, have grocery prices gone down a lot, down a little, stayed the same, gone up a little, gone up a lot? The dark green dots are gone up a lot. And you can see overall, 44% say up a lot, 32% say up a little, 13 stayed about the same, and I've combined down a little and down a lot because 11% say down a little and less than 0.5% say down a lot. So I just put those two categories together. But again, you see a big partisan split. Look at Republicans, where 25% say up a lot and 30% say up a little, versus Democrats, where it's 64 a lot and 23, independents, where it's 64 a lot and 23 a little up, and Democrats at 59 and 38. So Republicans are seeing less price increase at the grocery store than independents or Democrats. The question is, why is that? Maybe we all need to know where they're shopping, because that would be a good fight against inflation. But look, let's be straight about this. Partisanship plays such a big role in answering these questions. It's hardly surprising that Democrats think the worst of just about everything that can be associated with Donald Trump, and Republicans want to think good things about the economy and the president and inflation. And so they rate inflation a little less important, even though in the end they ended up putting it in second place for them. But here on this question about grocery prices, there's a real difference here. I don't have a slide for it, but it's interesting. On the perhaps dated assumption that women are more likely to do the grocery shopping than men, I looked at the answer to this question by gender and within party. Women say the prices have gone up considerably more than men do, but that's true among Republicans. Republican women think it's up more than Republican men. Independent women think it's up more than independent men, and Democratic women think it's up more than Democratic men. So if I'm right that this is who's more likely to do the grocery shopping or be aware of those prices, it is really striking that that overcomes the partisan bias. Now, all Republicans, whether men or women, think prices are not up as much compared to independents and Democrats, but that gender gap remains there within the Republican Party.
All right. Let's move on to Trump policy on inflation.
So top line, 57% think that Trump's policies generally will increase inflation. 30% say decrease inflation, and 12% won't make much difference. But again, this partisan difference. Fully 60% of Republicans think President Trump's policies will decrease inflation, compared to 69% of independents who think it will increase inflation and 96% among Democrats. See what I just said about partisan bias, wanting you to see the best or the worst in your party's president. But it is still pretty striking how much that gap is there on this question. We also asked about families' financial situation. How's your family doing financially? The green line is the percent who say they are living comfortably. The purple line is just getting by, and the red line is struggling. There's been only a little bit of change over this calendar year. If you just look over on the far right, percent comfortably moved up from February to June and now moved down just a little bit from June to October, but not much movement there. But if you look over the long run, you can see that that living comfortably was running at about 50% late in the Obama administration in 2016, rose pretty steadily throughout the Trump first term, getting up to over 60% in most of the polling in late in his term, fell off, no doubt in part because of COVID, but then stayed down and even went down further as inflation rose in 2022 and 23, and kind of bottomed out late in the Biden administration, and now has ticked up a little bit in the Trump administration, but as I said, moved up and now has slipped down just a little bit. Not a lot of change. And you can see the same thing going on in the struggling red line, where struggling people went down up through 2020 before rising pretty steadily into 22, 23, 24. And the struggling line does look like it's come down just a little bit this year in calendar 2025. So not a gigantic short-term change, but an important and revealing long-term change in how people feel about their financial situation. I think, well, again, the effects of inflation in 22 and 23 surely play a big role here.
Let's talk about the president's favorite word, according to him, tariffs.
Tariffs, 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 tariffs. There's been little movement on this over the last 9 months. 55% say tariffs hurt the economy, 33% say they help, and 11% don't make any difference. But Republicans, 64% are in favor of tariffs, think they help the economy. But 55% of independents, 95% of Democrats think they hurt the economy. You may have heard of this ad from Ontario about Ronald Reagan's speech against tariffs and in favor of free trade. Let's remember it was the Democrats then that absolutely wanted tariffs and were pounding away from them. Remember Dick Gephardt. So the parties have switched positions dramatically on this, and I think the data here reveals that as well. Democrats are adamantly opposed to tariffs, but if it were, well, Joe Biden kept many of Trump's tariffs in his administration. I don't recall that Democrats were adamantly opposed to Biden keeping those tariffs. So, again, partisan lenses. Okay, then it comes closer to home. We also asked, are tariffs helping or hurting Wisconsin farmers? You've probably seen the news that China has stopped buying soybeans, which has some problems for farmers. They're not being charged tariffs on that, but on the other hand, because we're exporting them, not importing them, but the sales are going down. Republicans are basically evenly split on this question. 31% think tariffs are helping farmers, 32% hurting farmers, 36% don't think tariffs have anything to do with this. But compare that with the 64% of Republicans who think tariffs help the economy generally. So much smaller, half as many think tariffs are helping Wisconsin farmers. Independents, 63% hurting, Democrats, 95% hurting. So there is some real shift there when you change the focus from something about the economy to something that we might have cousins in the farming world or possibly even our families.
Before we move on to the next, any questions in regards to tariffs? Yes.
I thought that it was more of a relationship.
We're going to get you a mic.
One
Oh, it's
second.
okay.
I was wondering about the relationship between inflation and immigration. In your chart, it seemed to show immigration wasn't a big thing, but it seemed to me it should be right next to inflation.
Yeah. The difference is when we just ask people, how concerned are you about illegal immigration? That overall level of concern is relatively low. But it's relatively low because Democrats especially put an extremely low concern on it, and independents are pretty low, about 31%. Republicans, though, put a high concern on it. When we went to the second question, which is which issue is most important to you, illegal immigration jumps up to second place. So that's the real difference. You have a divided public about concern about the issue, but when you ask what matters most to you, immigration pops up, but almost entirely because of so many Republicans who rate it first. And then those same Republicans rank inflation as their second most important problem. So they still keep inflation near the top. In fact, it's at the top of most important overall. But that's it. Inflation is not nearly as divided as the immigration question is. Thanks. Good.
Let me get the mic.
Thank you.
As a citizen who has to vote, if I read what you have just told us, what would our reaction be to Trump or an alternative?
Sure. Yeah, it would so nearly completely depend on which partisan side you were on. We are still seeing approval of Trump among Republicans in the high 80% range, and among people who voted for him last November, it's about 92% approved. There's been very little change. In fact, our very last slide will show you that from February to June, Trump's approval went down 1 percentage point. And from June to October, it went down 1 more percentage point. That's less movement than what we've seen in the national polling averages since he took office. But even in those national polling averages, his decline from January till now is about 5 or 6 percentage points. It's not, you may see headlines that say approval is cratering. It's been moving steadily down, but not dropping like a rock. And the reason is because the coalition that reelected Donald Trump is still very much behind him, and the people that opposed him are bitterly opposed to him. Nothing he could do would turn that 95% disapproval among Democrats into an only 90% disapproval, I don't think. And so this is part of the issue is, at least at this stage of the administration, people who chose their sides last fall in the presidential race are seeing no reason to change the sides. And if anything, they're gripping those positions even more strongly. Independents, though, have real reservations, and that's the thing to watch out for. And I think in the longer run, inflation has only modestly picked up since January. It's really not a big increase, but it is a little bit of an increase. Where are we in another 6 months or another 24 months? Where we'll have a better idea about whether we're getting a little bit of a rise or whether it's starting like we saw in 21 and 22, the beginning of a rise up to another 7, 8% inflation rate. I'm not an economist. I have no idea where it's going to end up. But I do think it's a little premature to decide whether these policies are going to end up pretty good or end up pretty badly or be some sort of a mix. So where you sit is how you see it.
Have you thought about including in issues of concern questions on either the federal deficit or debt or funding Social Security, funding Medicare?
Yeah, we have asked in the national poll about the deficit pretty frequently. More of a national issue, and that's why I tend to put it in the national instead of the state poll. People say they're concerned about it, but as soon as you make it hurt at all, they want to keep all their benefits and not cut spending. And this is a dilemma that's been with us forever, probably. I'm taking a class on the U.S. in 1815, and we were talking about it then, too. So some things remain pretty much the same. Other things, Social Security and Medicare, we have asked on the national, and it rates in sort of the upper middle, usually 10% to 12% rating it most important, but more important with Democrats, more important with older people. Matters to me. So that's the answer. One last thing is we also ask an open-ended question on the survey that just asks people, what are you concerned about in the country today? And John Johnson, our colleague and research fellow, usually writes those up and they appear on the law school blog a few days after the poll release. And there we're letting people tell us in their own words what matters to them. And we take a look at those things to design the next survey to see whether something is coming up frequently in those open-ended questions that we should put on this. So an example is climate change, where if you ask about climate change, you get a pretty high rating of concern, but it doesn't go very high in the most important problem question. And that's an example that I've been asked about before, is why don't we include that? It's based on what we're seeing in the data, but it's still worth tracking from time to time. Oh, hey.
Were you able to gather any information on the blame game over the government shutdown?
Coming up in just a second.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
But there's no blame. Nobody blames anybody. Yeah, you know I'm lying to you, right?
Well, with that transition, let's go into the blame game for the shutdown.
Happens to be the next slide. Good anticipation. They blame equally, basically. 38% Republican, 33% blame the Democrats, 28% blame both. Every national poll I've seen is similar. Slightly more say Republican than Democrat, and there's about a third or so that say both, pox on both your houses. But just look at the party splits on this. You just don't blame your team and you absolutely blame the other team. So Republicans, 71% blame the Democrats, just 2% blame their party. Democrats, 82% blame Republicans, 0% blame their party. But the all-knowing independents, 63% say both of you, a pox on both your houses. This is the least surprising finding you could possibly have, but I also think it's revealing and important to keep emphasizing just how much we don't see the faults in ourselves, but see it richly in our opponents.
Absolutely.
Well, and along the shutdown, let's talk about the extending the ACA tax credit.
Yes, a topic that I don't think was on many people's radars until fairly recently, and the shutdown has certainly exploited that, though, with if you weren't reading the paper, we extended tax credits for insurance bought on the Affordable Care Act's marketplace. Those credits expire at the end of this calendar year. And so with the expectation that they're going to expire, we're seeing a lot of stories now about what the rate for insurance will be for people who are affected by those credits expiring. So we explained very briefly that in the question. 58% would like to see the credits extended. We didn't say for how long, just extended. 41% said they should be allowed to expire. It's a pretty big partisan gap. 67% of Republicans say let them expire. just 31% say they should be extended. On the Democratic side, no surprise, 89% extend them, just 10% let them expire. And maybe a slightly surprising narrow gap among independents, 54 extend them, 45 let them expire. So on balance, favor extending them, but that balance is pretty heavily driven by that 89% of Democrats, not as much driven by the independents. And of course, it's held down a bit because of Republican opposition to extending them.
And favorability of the ACA?
Yeah, the act itself. And when we first started polling on this in 2012 and earlier polling in 2010, more people had an unfavorable view of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, than had a favorable view. And that was usually about a 10 to 15 point net unfavorable view. That pretty much lasted until the summer of 2017, when President Trump in the first term tried to repeal and replace it. Famously, John McCain cast the deciding vote to keep it. But that's where opinion really changed, when there became a real chance that it was going to go away. During that spring and summer of 2017, we saw favorable views outweigh unfavorable views. Haven't asked it in a long time, but you can see 53 favorable, 38 unfavorable, and 8% don't remember enough to have an opinion about it. And the partisan split is unsurprising. Just 15% of Republicans favorable to it, 74% unfavorable, versus 93-2 Democrats in favor. And a pretty sizable among independents, 63-28. That big gap with independents makes me a little surprised that extending the tax credits doesn't show a bigger gap with independents. But them's the data.
Now, this surprised me. I didn't know that we had such of a big issue with data centers, but
Yeah.
apparently we do.
Apparently we do. As you may know, at least Microsoft stopped doing a data center recently after the community opposed it, and there's been argument in other places. So here's the top line. 55% think the costs of data centers outweigh their benefits. 44% think the benefits outweigh the costs. So by a modest margin, doubt that data centers are worth the cost. But I think this is really interesting because there is no difference by party across this. I expected there to be some difference, but there's just not. And I think one of the things that teaches us is that if an issue is new and candidates haven't run campaigns on that issue, and the parties in the legislature or elsewhere haven't divided on the issue, party doesn't provide much of a guide to this question. And you can see from the data, it just absolutely doesn't divide the electorate in the usual expected ways. And in all three party groups, there's a little bit more that think the costs outweigh the benefits. So stay tuned. This seems to be an issue that may be with us for a little while, and we'll see whether it develops and whether we start to see a partisan gap. I don't have a slide. We also looked at it by area. These numbers are pretty much the same all across the state. The one exception is in the Madison media market, opposition or thinking the costs outweigh the benefits is a little bit higher.
These next couple of slides we can probably run through a little quicker.
Yeah, we're running a little late. Paid family leave, this was an issue that came up in the 2022 gubernatorial election, so I re-asked about it. This is about requiring businesses to provide paid family leave for new parents. 77% in favor, 22 opposed, but that's across the parties. 64% of Republicans in favor, 72 independent, 93 Dem. So that's sort of an interesting question where there's not as much of a partisan divide as you might have expected. Photo ID to vote, I'm going to run this pretty quickly, but big majority, 78% favor a photo ID to vote. That includes a majority across the parties, though Democrats are the more skeptical, but even they are 55% favor. When we first asked about this in 2012, when it was a hot issue, we were pretty evenly divided and there was a bigger party split. So that's that. But what about keeping Election Day registration? 78% favor keeping Election Day registration, including 62% of Republicans, 69 of independents, 96 of Dems. So you think about all the election controversies we've had over the last 5 years or so, it's interesting that photo ID, pretty much people think, yeah, that's sensible, we're for that. But we also really like our Election Day registration.
We have a new spin on it.
A new spin on it is whether you should have to prove your citizenship in order to register to vote. Now you simply sign that I certify I'm a citizen, and you can be prosecuted if that's false, but you don't have to prove it. So we asked, when you register to vote, should you have to show a passport or a birth certificate in order to register, prove your citizenship? 72% say you should have to do that. 92% of Republicans, 70% of independents, and it's a pretty even split, but 50% of Democrats say you should have to do that. So this is an issue where I think it's a sort of common sense sounding thing, prove your citizenship in order to vote. This is a big majority in favor of that, in line with same-day registration and photo ID. As someone who just this year had to write to the state of Pennsylvania and pay them $60 for my birth certificate so I could prove I was a citizen to get my real photo ID for my driver's license, which I'd put off, of course, and hadn't done. It's not free to get a birth certificate if you don't have one, and my passport was expired, so I couldn't use that. Okay, enough of woe is me. Real quick, concealed carry, another really hot topic back in 2012, now has a big majority in favor of concealed carry. With our current law, which requires you to get a license to do concealed carry. And again, this is across the partisan divide, though Democrats less supportive, but this was net negative for a lot of 2012 when it was being debated. But what about a new proposal? It's been around for a while, but it's come up again in the last month. What about concealed carry without requiring a license? This is sometimes called constitutional carry, that the Second Amendment gives you the right to carry without any licensing or certifications required. 78% are opposed to that. That includes 72% of Republicans, 60% of independents, and 90% of Democrats. So there's a big gap here between now 3/4 that support our current concealed carry law versus just over 3/4 that are opposed to an unlicensed constitutional carry. Incidentally, 27 states have unlicensed concealed carry laws, and in our national polling, less than half of the people that live in those states know that that's the law in their state. So it's an interesting question about what folks are aware of and how that plays out in politics. We got 2 minutes. Where do you want to go?
You touched on it, but I think we should hit that last slide that you had on.
Okay.
I think that's the last two.
Yeah. I'm going to go to this one, which is whether you would vote for a school referendum. More people said they would vote the green line for school referenda until this poll, where people voting against school referenda took a small lead. People have gotten more concerned about school spending and property taxes in particular. This is one to keep an eye on and see if this trend continues or if it's just a fluke of this sample. Evers' job approval, the green line, is ticked up just slightly this time. You can see over his whole term, he's almost always been more approving than disapproving. And here's President Trump over the long haul, more disapproved than approved. Since he took office, I mentioned this in passing, each survey, approval has gone down 1 point and disapproval up 1 point. So we haven't changed very much since he took office. I mentioned that earlier.
All right.
Okay?
Anybody have any quick question before we end our session?
Yeah.
Today I read in the paper that the president, I think they used the words killed. I don't know how many people in this boat coming out of a South American country. There was, of course, no due process.
Yeah.
No declaration of war. I'm going to ask the dean of the school, would you define that as premeditated murder? Have we crossed the line? Have we crossed the line on killing people?
This was an issue in the Obama administration where we used drone strikes in Pakistan and Afghanistan to target people. And it was pretty hotly debated at that point. That was closer to an actual war taking place, even if it too was an undeclared war by the usual standards of declarations of war. We haven't seen a whole lot of polling on this. We are asking about it in our national survey that will go in the field in November. We'll be releasing that, by the way, at the Aspen Center, Marquette's DC program, on November 19th. So we'll see how the public is reacting to the developments in this conflict with Venezuela and Colombia, I guess. But it is certainly a developing thing to track, and it's also interesting to listen to a few voices in Washington, Rand Paul in particular on the Republican side, raising concerns about it, and the question of President Trump, who ran opposed to U.S. involvement in wars, opposed to forever wars. So I think this is a developing issue, and how the public responds to it is still very much open to question from my point of view of whether these attacks are seen as defending America or seen as unlicensed wars. Okay.
All right, so I have a couple program notes. Our next program, November 12th, we'll have Dr. Maya Smart will be here to talk about reading. Despite the fact we're doing all of this work with reading, the reading scores in Wisconsin haven't gone up much in 25 years. So we will discuss that on November 12th. November 14th, we're doing a joint program with Common Ground in regards to the fact that Milwaukee County is a majority-minority county. However, if you go to any courthouse, go to the Milwaukee County Courthouse during jury duty and jury selection, you'll notice that it's not reflective of the community. So we're doing it's a program. It's going to start at 11:30, which is unusual for us, but it's going to be 11:30 because we have a half-hour documentary about the jury process, and then we're going to get into the program in regards to the jury selection process here in Wisconsin. So thank you all for being here. Dr. Franklin, thank you so much again.
Thank you.